7-minute lab, 7 minutes to stop rumination. I put the only non-hype protocol to the test. You're trapped, not by walls, not by chains, but by the relentless echo of your own thoughts. A single worry, a past regret, a future fear, circling endlessly like a predator in a cage, stripping away your peace, draining your energy, and leaving you hollow. It's the internal chatter that never seems to cease, the mental hamster wheel spinning faster and faster, promising escape but delivering only exhaustion. We've all been there, haven't we? That moment when the outside world fades, and the only reality is the dizzying, often terrifying landscape of our own minds. This isn't just a fleeting bad mood, it's a pervasive hum of anxiety, a constant background noise that distorts our perception, poisons our present, and steals our future joy. It's the insidious whisper that tells you you're not enough, that something terrible is about to happen, or that you should have acted differently, replaying scenarios with an agonizing detail that offers no resolution, only deeper despair. The modern world, with its constant barrage of information and social comparison, often exacerbates this internal turmoil, creating fertile ground for what psychologists call rumination. It's a vicious cycle, where dwelling on negative thoughts ironically generates more negative thoughts, trapping us in a self-perpetuating loop of distress. We search desperately for an off switch, a magic bullet, a quick fix that will silence the noise and restore a sense of calm. Many promise such a thing, offering simplistic advice that often crumbles under the weight of genuine human struggle. But what if the answer isn't about silencing the thoughts, but about fundamentally changing our relationship with them? What if the key lies not in escaping the echo, but in learning to navigate the labyrinth? This internal echo chamber, this persistent dwelling on worries and regrets, is a profound human experience, one that has occupied philosophers and thinkers for millennia. It's the shadow that follows us, the insistent voice that questions our choices, our worth, and our place in the world. It's the antithesis of presence, the thief of serenity, and the architect of a life lived perpetually in the past or future, never truly in the vibrant, fleeting now. We find ourselves endlessly dissecting conversations, replaying mistakes, or conjuring worst-case scenarios, convinced that by analyzing them to death, we will somehow gain control or find a hidden truth. Yet this obsessive mental activity rarely leads to insight. Instead, it often entrenches our anxieties, amplifies our insecurities, and leaves us feeling more powerless than before. It's the psychological equivalent of trying to untangle a knot by pulling harder on the threads. Each tug only tightens the bind. This pattern of thought, this mental molasses, is more than just a nuisance. It can become a defining characteristic of our inner lives, shaping our decisions, our relationships, and our overall sense of well-being. It's the unseen force that can turn a moment of potential joy into an occasion for dread, or a minor setback into a catastrophic event. The struggle against this internal cacophony is universal, cutting across cultures, ages, and backgrounds. It's the quiet battle fought behind closed doors, in the stillness of the night, or during moments of supposed relaxation that are instead consumed by the relentless whirring of the mind. We are, in essence, seeking a way to escape the prison of our own thoughts, to find a path back to clarity and peace in a world that often feels overwhelming. The quest for inner peace, for a respite from the relentless churn of the mind, is as old as consciousness itself. For centuries, humanity has grappled with the nature of thought, its power to both illuminate and torment. We are not merely beings who have thoughts. In many ways, we are our thoughts, or at least we often feel inextricably bound to them. This entanglement can lead us down paths of despair, where the mind becomes a labyrinth from which escape seems impossible. The problem isn't necessarily the presence of difficult thoughts, but our relationship with them, our tendency to become ensnared in their narratives, to mistake them for absolute truths rather than fleeting mental events. This internal friction, this constant replaying of what was or what might be, is a source of profound suffering, a drain on our vitality, and a barrier to genuine connection with ourselves and the world. It's the reason why so many of us feel perpetually on edge, anxious about the future or haunted by the past, unable to fully inhabit the present moment. We are often told to stop worrying or think positive, but these platitudes rarely offer a sustainable solution when the internal machinery is running at full tilt, spewing out a torrent of distressing narratives. The challenge lies in finding a more nuanced, a more profound way to approach this internal landscape, a way that doesn't involve brute force suppression, but rather a gentle, yet firm, redirection of our attention and our perspective. It's about understanding the mechanics of our own minds and discovering strategies that can foster a more harmonious coexistence with our inner world, transforming the torment of rumination into a space for growth and resilience. The human mind, a magnificent engine of creation and survival, can, when left unchecked, transform into a relentless interrogator, a judge and jury of our own existence. This phenomenon, the compulsive re-examination of past events and the anxious projection of future possibilities, is not merely a passive state, but an active engagement with a distorted reality. It's as if we've become trapped in a hall of mirrors, where every reflection is a distorted echo of a perceived failure or a potential threat, and we keep returning, hoping to find the original untarnished image. This isn't about learning from experience. It's about being imprisoned by it. It's the difference between dissecting a lesson to grow and endlessly picking at a wound until it festers. The mental energy expended in these cycles of rumination is immense, diverting resources from problem-solving, creativity, and the simple appreciation of life's unfolding moments. Consequently, what might have been a manageable challenge becomes an all-consuming crisis, a testament to the mind's capacity to magnify its own distress. Consider the individual who, after a mild disagreement, replays the conversation hundreds of times, dissecting every word, every facial expression, convinced they missed a subtle insult or an unspoken threat. This obsessive analysis, rather than providing clarity, entrenches the feeling of being wronged or misunderstood, fostering resentment and isolating the individual from genuine connection. The mind, in its attempt to assert control over an uncontrollable past or an unknowable future, paradoxically loses its grip on the present, the only realm where agency and peace are truly attainable. Further, the very nature of rumination often involves a focus on personal inadequacy or perceived blame. It's a self-directed critique that can become so ingrained it feels like an objective assessment of reality. This is where the wisdom of ancient Stoics, like Epictetus, offers a potent counterpoint. He famously stated, "We cannot choose our external circumstances, but we can always choose how we respond to them." This principle directly addresses the rumination trap. While we may not be able to unsay words or undo actions from the past, our response to those memories, our internal narrative about them, is entirely within our purview. Rumination often represents a failure to exercise this choice, an automatic falling back into a familiar pattern of self-recrimination. It's the difference between acknowledging a past mistake and using it as evidence of inherent flaw. For instance, someone who ruminates on a professional misstep might see it as proof they are incompetent, leading to a cycle of avoidance and self-sabotage. Conversely, applying Epictetus's insight, They might view the same event as a learning opportunity, a chance to refine their skills and approach, thereby transforming a potential source of endless shame into a catalyst for professional growth. This shift in perspective is not about denying the reality of the past event, but about choosing a more constructive interpretation of its significance. Another crucial layer to understanding rumination lies in its often implicit goal, a misguided pursuit of certainty or control. We ruminate because we believe that by re-examining a situation from every conceivable angle, we will somehow uncover a hidden factor that would have prevented the negative outcome, or that we will discover a perfect solution for future similar situations. This is an illusion. Life is inherently uncertain, and the past is immutable. The mind's attempt to create a sense of absolute control through exhaustive analysis is akin to trying to hold water in a sieve. The effort is exhausting, and the desired outcome is unattainable. The French philosopher Albert Camus, in his exploration of the absurd, highlighted humanity's innate desire for meaning and clarity in a universe that often offers neither. While Camus wasn't directly addressing rumination, his work illuminates the futility of seeking absolute answers where none exist. When we ruminate, we are often engaged in a struggle against this fundamental absurdity, trying to impose a perfect order on inherently chaotic experiences. Consider the individual who, after a breakup, endlessly analyzes what they could have done differently, believing that if they just understood why it happened perfectly, they could prevent future heartbreak. This is a desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable, to find a formula for love and connection in a realm that is fluid and unpredictable. Consequently, the practice of mindfulness, a concept deeply rooted in contemplative traditions and increasingly validated by modern psychology, offers a powerful antidote. Mindfulness is not about emptying the mind, but about observing thoughts and feelings without judgment, without becoming entangled in their narrative. It's about recognizing thoughts as transient mental events, like clouds passing across the sky, rather than as definitive truths about ourselves or the world. Now consider how this applies when you face a moment of intense worry. Instead of immediately diving into the spiral of what if, a mindful approach encourages you to simply notice the thought. There is the thought of losing my job. This act of noticing, of creating a small space between yourself and the thought, interrupts the automatic chain reaction of rumination. It allows you to observe the anxiety without necessarily being consumed by it. This is a skill that, like any other, requires practice. It's about gently bringing your attention back, again and again, to the present experience, whether it be the sensation of your breath, the sounds around you, or the simple act of being. This consistent redirection weakens the grip of habitual rumination and cultivates a greater sense of internal freedom and resilience. The relentless inward gaze of rumination often stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of the mind's architecture, specifically its role in narrative construction. We tend to conflate our internal stories with objective reality, believing that the persistent weaving of a particular plot, often one of victimhood, inadequacy, or impending doom, accurately reflects our circumstances. This is akin to a writer becoming so engrossed in their fictional world that they forget they are the author, believing the characters' fates are immutable and external. The psychological concept of cognitive schemas, deeply ingrained patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving, plays a significant role here. When a negative schema is activated, it acts like a filter, selectively attending to information that confirms its validity while dismissing evidence to the contrary. For example, someone with a schema of unlovability might ruminate excessively on a perceived slight from a friend, interpreting it as definitive proof of their inherent flaw, while overlooking the friend's consistent acts of kindness and support. This selective attention fuels the rumination cycle, creating a self-reinforcing loop where the narrative becomes increasingly entrenched and believable, even if it bears little resemblance to objective reality. The mind, in its drive for coherence, crafts a story, and rumination is the process of endlessly polishing that story until it gleams with a false sense of truth. Furthermore, the very act of rumination can feel productive, offering a false sense of agency. We believe that by dissecting a problem or a past hurt repeatedly, we are actively working towards a solution or closure. This is a cognitive distortion, a subtle form of intellectual procrastination. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, in his exploration of anxiety, described it as the dizziness of freedom. Rumination can be seen as a way to sidestep this dizzying freedom by clinging to a familiar, albeit painful, narrative. Instead of confronting the ambiguity and making difficult choices that might lead to genuine resolution, we retreat into the predictable territory of rehashing. Consider the student who, instead of studying for a challenging exam, spends hours agonizing over a past academic failure, replaying the moment they received a poor grade, convinced that a deeper understanding of why they failed then will somehow magically prepare them for the current test. This is a classic example of using intellectualization as a defense mechanism, avoiding the present task by getting lost in the past. The mind, seeking to avoid the discomfort of uncertainty and effort, finds solace in the illusion of deep analysis, a comfort that ultimately hinders progress. Building on this, the evolutionary underpinnings of our brains can also contribute to the rumination trap. Our ancestors' survival often depended on vigilance, on constantly scanning for threats and analyzing potential dangers. This hyper-awareness, while once crucial, can become maladaptive in the modern world, where threats are often psychological rather than physical. When faced with stresses like job insecurity or social anxieties, this ancient threat detection system can misfire, triggering a cascade of worry and what-if scenarios that have no immediate, tangible solution. It's as if our internal alarm system is set to a hair trigger, constantly sensing danger where none truly exists. For instance, a person receiving a critical but constructive email from their boss might experience an immediate surge of dread, their mind immediately conjuring images of termination or professional ruin, a disproportionate response rooted in an exaggerated threat assessment. This evolutionary legacy means that our minds are predisposed to dwelling on the negative, a tendency that rumination amplifies. It's not a character flaw, it's a feature of our biological wiring that we must learn to manage. Conversely, the concept of post-event processing in social psychology sheds further light on how rumination can distort our perception of interpersonal interactions. After a social encounter, individuals prone to rumination will often replay the event, focusing on their perceived social blunders, awkward silences, or missed opportunities to impress. They might replay a conversation, scrutinizing their own dialogue for signs of social ineptitude, or interpreting neutral expressions from others as indicators of disapproval. This detailed, often negative self-appraisal can lead to increased social anxiety and avoidance, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. The fear of social failure leads to rumination, which increases anxiety, which in turn makes future social interactions more challenging. Imagine someone attending a party and afterwards spending the entire next day mentally replaying every interaction, convinced they were awkward and uninteresting, despite receiving compliments and engaging in pleasant conversations. This distorted memory, fueled by rumination, becomes the new baseline for their social self-perception, making them reluctant to attend future gatherings. Another crucial layer is the role of emotional avoidance. Often rumination isn't just about the content of the thoughts themselves, but about the underlying emotions they help us avoid confronting directly. For example, someone might ruminate incessantly about financial worries, not necessarily because they are actively seeking a solution, but because the thought of their own mortality or the fear of losing control over their life is too overwhelming to face. The financial worries, while distressing, offer a more manageable, albeit still painful, focus than the existential dread they mask. It's like a child who, afraid of the dark, focuses intently on the pattern of the wallpaper to avoid thinking about what might be lurking in the shadows. The rumination becomes a sophisticated, yet ultimately ineffective, coping mechanism, a way of staying busy with distress so as not to feel deeper, more profound discomfort. This is why simply trying to stop thinking about the worrisome topic rarely works. The underlying emotional current is still there, seeking an outlet, and will find it again through the same or a similar narrative. The persistent internal dialogue of rumination can be understood as a form of cognitive rigidity, a steadfast refusal to allow the mind to adapt and move forward. It's as if the brain, having encountered a perceived problem or threat, becomes fixated on that specific configuration, unable to disengage and reorient itself. This rigidity is often exacerbated by a fear of the unknown future, which the mind attempts to preemptively control by endlessly dissecting the known past. The mind, in its quest for certainty, creates a feedback loop where dwelling on past events, particularly those associated with regret or discomfort, becomes a substitute for actively engaging with the uncertainties of tomorrow. This is a subtle but critical distinction from simply learning from mistakes. Learning involves integration and forward momentum. Rumination involves reliving and stagnation. Consider the individual who, after a significant career setback, finds themselves constantly replaying the events leading up to their termination. They might meticulously catalogue every perceived misstep, every overlooked warning sign, convinced that a perfect understanding of the past will somehow inoculate them against future professional failures. However, this deep dive into the past, rather than offering protection, often paralyzes them, making them risk-averse and less likely to pursue new opportunities for fear of repeating the same pattern. The mind, in its attempt to gain mastery over the past, forfeits its capacity to act effectively in the present. Furthermore, the narrative structure of rumination often prioritizes a sense of coherence, even if that coherence is built on negativity. Our brains are storytelling machines, constantly trying to make sense of our experiences by weaving them into a coherent personal history. When faced with events that are particularly jarring or emotionally charged, the mind may latch onto a particular interpretation or narrative thread as a way of imposing order. Rumination is the process of endlessly polishing and reinforcing this chosen narrative, making it feel increasingly solid and irrefutable. This is not necessarily a conscious choice, it's a deeply ingrained psychological process. Imagine someone who experienced a betrayal in a past relationship. They might ruminate on the specific instances of deception, constructing a narrative of their ex-partner as inherently deceitful and themselves as a naive victim. While the betrayal was real, the constant retelling and embellishment of this narrative can serve to solidify their identity as someone who is perpetually wronged, rather than as someone who has overcome adversity and grown. This narrative becomes a protective shell, albeit a confining one, shielding them from the vulnerability of trusting again, but at the cost of genuine connection and emotional freedom. Another layer to consider is the impact of rumination on our perception of time itself. When we are caught in a cycle of dwelling on the past or anxiously anticipating the future, our experience of the present moment becomes distorted. The present can feel fleeting, insignificant, or merely a transitional phase leading towards the real drama of the past or future. This temporal distortion is a hallmark of rumination. For example, a person preparing for a major life event, like a wedding or a significant move, might find themselves so consumed by anxieties about potential problems or regrets about past decisions that the actual experience of preparing for and participating in the event is overshadowed. The precious moments leading up to the event or the joy of the event itself are lost, consumed by the mental rehashing of what-ifs and should-haves. Time, which is inherently fluid, becomes rigid and oppressive, marked not by lived experience, but by the relentless recurrence of the same obsessive thoughts. This temporal disconnect can lead to profound feelings of regret, not for things done, but for moments unlived, for the present that was sacrificed on the altar of internal preoccupation. The social dimension also plays a crucial role. While rumination is an internal process, it is often influenced by and can influence our social interactions. The tendency to ruminate can lead to social withdrawal, as individuals fear that their internal turmoil will be apparent to others, or that their preoccupation will make them poor conversationalists. Conversely, the act of sharing one's ruminative thoughts with others, while sometimes helpful for gaining perspective, can also inadvertently reinforce the problematic thought patterns if not handled with care. Consider individuals who frequently vent about the same recurring problems to their friends. While they may seek empathy, the repeated articulation of the same anxieties can solidify those anxieties in their own minds and in the minds of their listeners, creating a shared narrative of helplessness. This isn't to say that sharing is inherently bad, but rather that the quality and purpose of that sharing are paramount. When the sharing becomes a way to endlessly recirculate the same distressing thoughts without seeking new insights or solutions, it can become another facet of the rumination cycle, trapping both the individual and their sympathetic audience in a loop of shared worry. The mind's tendency to engage in rumination can be understood, in part, through the lens of attentional bias. This bias describes how our minds are disproportionately drawn to certain types of information, often those that are perceived as threatening or emotionally salient. When this bias is directed towards past negative experiences or future anxieties, it fuels the cycle of rumination. It's like having a mental spotlight that, instead of illuminating the full spectrum of our experience, is permanently fixed on a small, often dark, corner. This spotlight doesn't just highlight, it magnifies, making minor perceived flaws or potential risks loom far larger than they actually are. Consequently, the individual becomes less aware of positive stimuli, opportunities, or the present moment's neutral or pleasant aspects, as their attentional resources are predominantly consumed by the ruminative content. For instance, someone might receive a performance review that is overwhelmingly positive, with only one minor suggestion for improvement. Yet, their attentional bias, amplified by rumination, causes them to fixate solely on that single point of criticism, magnifying its significance and initiating a cascade of self-doubt and worry about their overall competence. The positive feedback, the evidence of their success, is effectively ignored, rendered invisible by the relentless focus on the perceived deficiency. This selective attention reinforces the negative narrative, making it feel more real and more pervasive than the broader reality. Furthermore, the concept of metacognition, our awareness of and thinking about our own thinking, plays a pivotal role in perpetuating rumination. While metacognition can be a powerful tool for self-understanding and problem-solving, a distorted form of it can actually feed the ruminative process. This occurs when individuals engage in rumination on rumination, essentially worrying about their worrying. They become critical of their own tendency to ruminate, viewing it as a sign of weakness or failure. This self-critical loop adds another layer of distress, making the original source of anxiety seem even more intractable. For example, someone might spend an hour worrying about an upcoming presentation, Then they might spend another hour worrying about the fact that they are worrying so much, feeling frustrated with themselves for being unable to simply let it go. This second layer of worry about the worrying itself creates a more complex and entrenched pattern of distress, diverting energy not only from addressing the initial concern, but also from engaging in more adaptive coping strategies. It's a meta-level of anxiety that can be particularly difficult to break free from, as the very act of trying to escape the thoughts becomes another source of distress. Another crucial aspect to consider is the role of narrative coherence and identity formation in rumination. Our sense of self is deeply intertwined with the stories we tell ourselves about our lives. When faced with negative experiences, particularly those that challenge our sense of competence, worth, or agency, the mind may attempt to construct a narrative that explains these events and preserves a semblance of self-understanding. Rumination can become the mechanism through which this narrative is repeatedly rehearsed and solidified. If an individual's core identity is threatened by a significant failure or loss, they might engage in rumination to construct a story that explains this event in a way that, paradoxically, maintains a sense of continuity and predictability, even if that narrative is one of victimhood or helplessness. Consider someone who has experienced a profound personal loss. They might ruminate on the what-ifs and if-onlys, not necessarily to find a solution, but to build a narrative around the event that makes sense of their grief and their altered life circumstances. This narrative, while painful, provides a framework for understanding their new reality, offering a form of psychological anchorage, however precarious. The constant revisiting of the event becomes a way of embedding it into their life story, making it a definitive rather than a transformative experience. The impact of rumination on our capacity for future-oriented thinking and goal pursuit is also significant. When the mind is predominantly occupied with replaying past events or anxiously forecasting negative future outcomes, its ability to engage in constructive planning and effective goal-directed behavior is diminished. The mental energy that could be channeled into strategizing, problem-solving, or pursuing aspirations is instead consumed by the unproductive loop of worry. This can lead to a state of psychological inertia, where individuals feel stuck, unable to move forward with their lives because their cognitive resources are perpetually diverted to the past or the imagined perils of the future. For instance, an entrepreneur might be so consumed with ruminating on past business failures and potential future market downturns that they are unable to dedicate the necessary focus and creativity to developing new ventures or adapting their current strategies. The imagined obstacles, rehearsed endlessly in their mind, become more potent than the actual challenges and opportunities present in the real world, effectively preventing them from taking meaningful action. Finally, it is essential to recognize that rumination is not an isolated phenomenon, but is often deeply interconnected with other psychological states, such as perfectionism and a low tolerance for uncertainty. Individuals who hold themselves to exceptionally high standards or who struggle with the inherent ambiguity of life may be more prone to ruminative thought patterns. Perfectionism can fuel rumination by creating an internal pressure to analyze every detail to ensure flawless execution, leading to endless re-evaluation of past actions or future plans. Similarly, a low tolerance for uncertainty can manifest as rumination, as the mind attempts to eliminate all potential risks and ambiguities by endlessly simulating worst-case scenarios. For example, a student who is a perfectionist might ruminate extensively on a minor error in an essay, believing that this single flaw will derail their entire academic career. Their inability to accept imperfection and their fear of negative judgment drive them to repeatedly scrutinize their work, preventing them from moving on to new tasks or fully appreciating their overall academic achievements. This interplay between rumination and underlying traits like perfectionism underscores the complexity of the issue and the need for multifaceted approaches to address it. The persistent internal monologue of rumination, while deeply personal, is often shaped by subtle societal pressures and the pervasive cultural narratives we absorb. Consider the modern emphasis on self-optimization and the constant bombardment of idealized lives on social media. This creates an environment where perceived flaws or past missteps can become amplified, not just in our own minds, but through the implicit comparison with curated online personas. The pressure to present a perfect, continually improving self can lead to an intensified internal scrutiny, where any deviation from this idealized trajectory is met with disproportionate self-criticism and, consequently, rumination. For instance, an individual might spend hours replaying a moment of perceived social awkwardness at a gathering, not just because of personal insecurity, but because this moment stands in stark contrast to the effortlessly charming and successful image they feel compelled to project, both to themselves and to their online network. This external pressure to perform a flawless existence can thus internalize, becoming a breeding ground for the relentless replay of perceived imperfections. Furthermore, the way we conceptualize progress can inadvertently fuel rumination. Often, progress is framed as a linear ascent, a constant upward trajectory towards greater achievement and happiness. When individuals experience setbacks, or when life presents an unexpected detour, this linear model can create cognitive dissonance. The mind, struggling to reconcile the reality of the setback with the ingrained narrative of continuous progress, may resort to rumination as a way to retrace its steps and identify where the deviation occurred. This isn't about genuine learning. It's about trying to force reality back onto the predetermined linear path. Think of someone who, after being laid off, endlessly dissects their job performance, not to learn from the experience, but to understand precisely when and how they failed to maintain this expected upward trajectory. This obsessive backward glance prevents them from engaging with the present situation, exploring new possibilities, or redefining what progress might mean in their current context. The mental energy is spent trying to correct a past that cannot be altered, rather than charting a new course forward. Another critical facet is the influence of language on our ruminative patterns. The very words we use to describe our experiences can shape how we engage with them. For example, framing a difficult situation as a catastrophe or a failure inherently invites a more dramatic and prolonged internal dialogue than describing it as a challenge or a learning opportunity. The language of finality and absolute negativity tends to lock us into a particular perspective, making it harder for the mind to explore alternative interpretations or solutions. Consider someone who, after receiving constructive criticism on a project, describes the feedback as devastating and the project itself as a complete disaster. This highly charged language immediately triggers a more intense emotional response and encourages a deeper, more prolonged rumination on the perceived flaws, rather than a pragmatic assessment of the feedback and a plan for improvement. The semantic framing predisposes the mind to a particular narrative, one that is difficult to dislodge once established. Moreover, the role of unresolved emotional conflicts, often stemming from early life experiences, can manifest as habitual rumination in adulthood. These underlying emotional residues, when triggered by current life events, can lead to a disproportionate and persistent focus on specific themes or worries. The rumination, in this context, becomes a form of delayed emotional processing, a way for the psyche to repeatedly engage with a past hurt or unmet need, even if the conscious awareness of the original source is obscured. For instance, An individual who experienced significant emotional neglect in childhood might find themselves prone to ruminating on perceived slights or lack of validation in their current relationships. While the immediate trigger might be a minor comment or an overlooked gesture, the underlying emotional resonance connects to a deeper, unresolved longing for acceptance and care, leading to an extended internal replay of the perceived rejection. This connection to past emotional landscapes highlights how rumination can be a symptom of deeper psychological work that needs to be undertaken, rather than simply a habit to be broken. Finally, the cultural emphasis on problem-solving can, paradoxically, contribute to rumination. We are often conditioned to believe that every problem has a solution and that diligent effort will invariably lead to resolution. While this can be a powerful motivator, it can also lead to a state of perpetual unease when faced with situations that are inherently ambiguous or lack clear-cut answers. The mind, driven by this problem-solving imperative, may engage in rumination, endlessly searching for a solution where none exists or where the solution is simply acceptance. Think of someone facing a chronic illness or a complex ethical dilemma. The ingrained belief that there must be a way to fix it can lead to persistent rumination, as they exhaust every possible avenue of thought, seeking a definitive resolution that the situation itself does not readily offer. This can create a profound sense of frustration and helplessness, as the very drive to solve the problem becomes a source of ongoing distress. The mental energy is thus spent on an ultimately futile quest for a singular, definitive answer, rather than on adapting, coping, and finding meaning within the existing circumstances. Reflecting on this journey so far, we've navigated the intricate landscape of the mind, witnessing how its very mechanisms, designed for survival and understanding, can sometimes ensnare us. The persistent echo of thought, so often mistaken for an inescapable reality, reveals itself not as a monolithic prison, but as a complex interplay of perception, interpretation, and learned patterns. The way we engage with our inner world, the stories we weave, and the attentional biases that subtly guide our focus all converge to shape the contours of our experience. It's as if we've been tracing the currents of a powerful river, understanding its eddies and undertows, its capacity to both nourish and erode. Each philosophical lens and psychological insight has offered a unique vantage point, illuminating the subtle forces at play when the mind turns inward with relentless intensity. As we pivot towards the final reflection, consider the cumulative effect of these explorations. The initial provocations have led us through a deepening understanding of the mind's architecture, revealing how deeply ingrained habits of thought can sculpt our perception of self and reality. The various perspectives, from ancient wisdom to contemporary research, have collectively underscored a fundamental truth. Our relationship with our thoughts is not a fixed destiny, but a dynamic field of engagement. The implications of this are profound, suggesting that the very nature of our internal struggle can be reframed not as a battle to be won through brute force, but as an opportunity for a more nuanced and skillful interaction. The landscape of our inner lives, once perceived as a chaotic storm, begins to reveal patterns, pathways, and the subtle yet potent influence of our own conscious engagement. In light of these insights, the path forward becomes clearer, not as a destination, but as a shift in perspective. The intricate tapestry woven from diverse threads of thought and experience now leads us towards a more integrated understanding. It's akin to understanding the individual components of a complex machine, the gears, the levers, the circuits, and beginning to grasp how their coordinated movement creates a functional whole. The convergence of these ideas points towards a more embodied wisdom, a recognition that true liberation from internal turmoil lies not in escaping the mind, but in cultivating a more harmonious and discerning relationship with its processes. This journey has prepared us to consider what this refined relationship might truly entail, moving from intellectual apprehension to a more lived understanding. What if the echo isn't a cage, but a compass? For so long, we've treated the persistent whispers of our minds as adversaries, as disruptions to a desired state of peace. We've sought to silence them, to outrun them, to build walls against their relentless return. Yet as we've explored, this very struggle often intensifies the noise, tightening the grip of rumination and drawing us further into the labyrinth. The insights gathered suggest a profound reorientation. The thoughts that torment us are not inherently enemies, but rather messengers, albeit often cryptic ones, carrying vital information about our inner landscape. The pain, the anxiety, the regret, these are not random occurrences but signals pointing towards unmet needs, unresolved conflicts, or deeply held beliefs that require our attention. To truly find solace, then, is not to achieve a state of mental emptiness, but to cultivate a discerning, compassionate awareness of these internal signals. It is to learn the language of our own minds, to understand the narratives we construct, and to recognize the patterns that keep us bound. This understanding shifts the focus from eradication to integration, from a battle of wills to a dance of awareness. This journey has illuminated that the perceived productivity of rumination is, in fact, an illusion, a cognitive trick that offers the feeling of control while perpetuating stagnation. The mind, in its relentless pursuit of certainty and its aversion to ambiguity, can become a prisoner of its own analytical engine. Yet the wisdom gleaned reveals that true agency lies not in dissecting the past into oblivion, or in preemptively solving every future hypothetical, but in the present moment's capacity for mindful engagement. It's about recognizing that the power to shape our experience resides in our ability to choose our response, to reframe our interpretations, and to redirect our attention with gentle persistence. The constant replaying of perceived failures or anxieties, while seductive in its promise of eventual clarity, ultimately saps our vital energy and blinds us to the opportunities and joys that lie just beyond its narrow focus. The key, then, is not to eliminate these thoughts, but to loosen their hold, to see them for what they are, transient mental events, not immutable truths. The implication of this entire exploration is that the path to inner peace is not paved with the eradication of difficult thoughts, but with the cultivation of a wise and compassionate relationship with them. It is about embracing the inherent messiness of human experience and learning to navigate it with presence rather than avoidance. The relentless echo, when met with awareness instead of resistance, can transform from a source of torment into a guide. It can point us towards areas of our lives that require deeper healing, toward beliefs that need to be challenged, and toward a more authentic way of being in the world. This is not a quick fix, nor is it a passive surrender. It is an active, ongoing practice of self-inquiry, a commitment to understanding the intricate workings of our own consciousness. The true practice begins now, not in the grand gesture, but in the quiet moments of noticing, of choosing presence over preoccupation, and of extending kindness to the very thoughts that once seemed